Good evening, everyone, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to watching the show tonight. And I'm also delighted that we're going to have a really excellent guest to discuss the issues of the day with me. This gentleman is going to join me. We're going to be discussing strangely political adverts. We're going to just be discussing the latest by-election, the potential Labour disaster. Oh dear, what a shame. And we will be discussing the state of politics and the Northern Ireland agreement, amongst other things. This gentleman is an esteemed former member of the European Parliament, who had a fantastic business career, someone who, to me, has always been something of a mentor and someone who I've always considered to be the way a politician should be. And he's never shy of strong opinions, which he puts with great grace and charm. Ladies and gentlemen, Roger Helmer.
Good evening, Bill. Great to be on the show, and many thanks for your wonderful introduction.
It's a pleasure, Roger. It's a pleasure. I think it's always right to say it as you see it. So, without further ado, because we've got loads to talk about tonight, and I always enjoy our head-to-heads. It's always good fun. I gather from your Twitter feed that you've been somewhat peeved at Barclays Bank and their latest piece of advertising. What have they done to upset you, Roger?
Well, it goes back really way beyond Barclays. The earliest example I can remember getting excited about was Gillette. And do you remember they did a whole series of advertisements that really had nothing to do with shaving, but was all about what men should be like and what men are like and why men are guilty of being nasty to women and so on and so on. And there was, in fact, a huge backlash of Gillette users against Gillette for taking that line. But it seems to have become the fashionable thing. And company after company is producing all these sort of environmental, woke, anti-racist elements into their campaigns. Legal and General, for example, are doing it all the time on Twitter. Many other companies and many organizations. We've got Barclays doing it. We've got the National Trust, which has been doing all kind of woke stuff, and by the way, offending their volunteers, never mind their members. You've also, in addition to the National Trust, you have Oxfam, and you will have seen the story this week about Oxfam circulating a questionnaire to their members, to their employees, about their degree of wokeness, their awareness of racial issues, and so on. I was particularly shocked by that. And in fact, I've been doing a bit of media on it through the week. But particularly because they start from the assumption, it's this idea of unconscious bias. Are you suffering from unconscious bias? If you confess, then obviously you're suffering from unconscious bias. If you deny it, then you prove that your bias is unconscious.
It's a little bit like how they used to detect a witch, isn't it? If they duck the witch under the water and she drowns, then she wasn't a witch, and if she floats, she's a witch and she's going to be burned.
Exactly. You die either way. In other words, it is set up to prove people guilty, rather in the way that communist courts work, where they have a 99.8% conviction rate. We are all guilty. I mean, that was a tagline that the Telegraph used in its satirical Peter Simple column 40 years ago. We are all guilty. But that seems to be the attitude. But what I'm encouraged by is the way that the employees, particularly of Oxfam. Now, Oxfam is going to attract the sort of people, I would think, who are very keen on social issues, very keen on charity, very keen on helping the third world, just the sort of people you might expect to take a slightly woke attitude. And yet what we are reading in the press is that there's been a huge backlash by Oxfam employees against these attitudes. And I've only just become aware of the Barclays approach, but I suspect that there will be quite a number of Barclays employees and perhaps quite a number of Barclays customers who might think, look, the purpose of banking is to provide a good banking service, or if you happen to be a shareholder, it's to provide a return on capital and a secure place to invest. That is what you should stick to. of course you obey the rules. One of the things that you and I are both aware of, Bill, is the amount of legislation there is governing companies in their treatment of staff, in their treatment of the environment, in their treatment of employee issues where fairness is raised, on non-discrimination. All these things are already governed by the law. So provided companies observe the law, surely they should concentrate on getting on with their business and not concentrate on social engineering. That is what I draw attention to. I did with Barclays, but I did with Oxfam beforehand, and will probably keep doing so.
So, are you really suggesting that Barclays shouldn't be lecturing us on the life story and situations of transgender people in their advertising? I mean, surely that's an important social responsibility of a corporation to fill us in with the issues facing people with gender issues.
It's certainly an important current debate. I was very interested to see, by the way, and I know you're going to come to the by-election shortly, but gorgeous George Galloway was extremely forthright on these issues. And although I don't agree with him on many things, I did rather admire his courage and forthrightness in dealing with that particular issue. But it's a great public debate. You can't open the newspaper or turn on the television without hearing references to it and different points of view put from one side and the other. I think that is adequately aired, adequately dealt with in the public square without corporations getting in on the act. And as I say, they should stick to the knitting. They have objectives which are important to their customers, important to their investors, important to the wider community, because people tend to think of investors as being rich people. Most of the investors will turn out actually to be people like pension funds, and really quite run-of-the-mill people with modest incomes are depending on the stock market and stock market dividends actually for the pensions they depend on. So these are important things. It isn't a case of the economy, the capitalist economy, making money for bloated fat cats. It's keeping people in jobs. It's paying people, it's paying the government the taxes that enable us to run education and defense and the NHS and all those things. We all have an interest in capitalism working, and if it fails to work, we all suffer. So it is good that somebody should pay attention to it. And if it isn't going to be the corporations paying attention to it, I ask, who is going to do it?
Yes, exactly. And I think, unfortunately, there is crony capitalism, which takes away the purity of the idea, and some of these corporations are involved in it. And I'd like to draw attention, actually, because the reason I mention about this Barclays advert is because there's another bank advert that really drives me to the point of absolute rage. And it is that appalling, boring bloke on the HSBC adverts who's constantly saying, "We are not an island." Well, for a start, we are, but also everything he's saying is about trying to break down the difference between us and everyone else. And we are not exceptional. We are not unique. We are not different. We're a part of this. And I think they have a diagram that shows this interconnected world, like circuitry going across it. Now, that to me is the epitome of everything I've ever wanted to fight against, and certainly makes me not want to use the Hong Kong and Shanghai banking company. It makes me actually feel more inclined to picket them. And this is the kind of thing that these adverts are doing. They are putting across a political message, because I don't believe that they really need to advertise. So they're using their money and their funds to social engineer and to affect public opinion.
Do you know, Bill, you're taking me back to 1972, 1973, believe it or not, when I was working abroad for the first time. I was actually working in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was an exciting, vibrant place, and I was terribly excited about the skyscrapers and the buzz and so on. Of course, the skyscrapers are twice as high today as they were in 1972. But the two dominant skyscrapers on the city skyline there were Standard Chartered and HSBC. And I was kind of impressed because they were big, solid banks, seemed to be doing a marvelous international type of job. And I was impressed by them. But the problem with HSBC, of course, it operates so much in China, and so much of what it does depends upon China, that they are now kowtowing to the Chinese Communist Party. They have not condemned any of the actions of the Communist Party, whether it's in Hong Kong itself or whether it's the abuse of the Uyghurs or whatever, especially not the threats being made and the saber rattling against Taiwan. They are frightened for their business. Now, I appreciate they're in a difficult position. If I were the chief executive of HSBC and I had to weigh up, well, do I take a moral stance in relation to what China is doing in all these spheres, or do I kowtow to the top Communist Party and keep making money? It would be very tempting to keep making money. But frankly, from where I'm sitting, it doesn't earn my respect. And to be lectured on moral issues by these companies, many of which, by the way, I won't speak about HSBC because I don't know the exact limits of their geographical range, but many of the companies which are proudly virtue signaling and displaying what wonderful folk they are still perfectly happy to operate in countries like Saudi Arabia, where human liberties and freedoms are almost completely ignored. They don't say a word about that, but they say a great deal about what terrible racists white people are in Britain.
Yes, yes, and it is absolutely frustrating. There's another one, a story actually. I think it's broken out today. Actually, the Spectator had a whistleblower from the National Trust, I believe it was, where they're asking people, did they vote for Brexit? And if they did, they're not giving them a job. Now, this is being contested by the National Trust, who've said, "Oh no, this isn't the case." But this whistleblower the Spectator is no small beer, and they've seen fit to print this. Now, if that's the kind of thing that's going on, it really has become very sinister.
No, I agree with you. It is an absolute disgrace, especially when you consider that not only was Brexit a view held by many of the British people, it was actually the majority view, as we demonstrated in the referendum. And let us hope this isn't true. It seems on the face of it a bit like a tall order, but we've seen so much wokeism from the National Trust and other organizations that you have to ask yourself, could this be the case? The National Trust AGM takes place. It has to take place later this year. I don't think they've fixed a date for it yet. But I think there will be a vocal group of National Trust members, and I hope to be supporting them. You will have heard there's an organization called Reform Trust, which is an organization of National Trust members, but those who disagree with many of these things which the trust management is doing. They have already, I think, achieved the resignation of, was it the chief executive or the general secretary, the top man there, effectively, the top operating officer. He saw the sort of proposals that were coming up for the AGM and decided to jump before he was pushed. So they are getting some results. And I personally shall be looking carefully at the resolutions that are proposed at the AGM. I'm a life member of the National Trust. And I shall be voting accordingly. And I think an awful lot of other National Trust members will be doing the same thing.
Well, watch out the leadership of the National Trust, because I've seen you in action many a time, Roger, and I'm sure they won't be having the easiest of rides. So we've covered some of this ground and thrown up a lot of issues here that are going on. And whilst some of them are frustrating and annoying, the general gist of corporations telling us what to do, how to live our lives, is a common thread, or corporations, large trusts, etc., etc. But an ongoing assault on democratic values. And I'd like to lead in actually talking about corporations and so-called democracy. Reports are now coming out that Matt Hancock had many unminuted meetings with people who were supposedly providing PHE equipment and so on and so forth in the early stages of the pandemic, and also that he was having emails on his own personal email account rather than through the government accounts. Government and big corporations working together without public scrutiny. Thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. And I think we need to put the whole Matt Hancock story into a bit of perspective. You know, I'm not necessarily encouraging Matt Hancock and other ministers to have affairs with their staff. It clearly goes against traditional morality. I think it's true probably that people are a bit less concerned about traditional morality than they were. But there are a whole lot of other issues, as you rightly point out, around this resignation, which are much more important than the direct issue of personal morality. I think the one of the first ones that you've pointed out is the placing of contracts. Now, I'm prepared to accept that the government was facing a crisis and they had to move very, very quickly indeed. But if it turns out that Matt Hancock failed to declare conflicts of interest, for example, if he or his close relatives had a financial interest in some of the companies that got the contracts, then I think he has a lot of big questions to answer. There is the question of government security. How is it that anyone can get this sort of footage out of a minister's office? And I think that it's no good the department having an internal investigation. I would have thought the police and MI5 ought to be all over it. It's absolutely shocking. What happens if they're doing the same thing in the Ministry of Defense, or indeed in MI5 itself? What happens if somebody in Russia is watching what our ministers are saying privately in their offices? These are huge issues. And so I think these are the things that really need to be thoroughly investigated. The security issue, the award of contracts issue, and the question of this young lady herself. I can never remember the name, Cola D'Angelo. Dare I mention, I just saw a very funny cartoon going around on Twitter, excuse me, which was Boris Johnson saying to Matt Hancock, "No, when I said screw the foreign aid, I was referring to the money we send abroad. I wasn't referring to your personal office," which I thought was rather a nice touch.
Well, she does actually. I must say, she does put me in mind of something. I don't know if you remember the famous Mrs. Merton comedy sketch where she was interviewing Debbie McGee, the wife of Paul Daniels, and she said, "Oh yes, the beautiful and attractive Debbie McGee. What was it that first attracted you to the millionaire Paul Daniels?" And I wonder, you know, looking at this lady who's rather attractive, to say the very least, I would say, but happens to have family that's involved in businesses that are involved in the health sector. I wonder what it was that she found so attractive about the rather bizarre Mr. Hancock. I'm sure it was just a natural crush that they developed on each other, and she had no motives at all.
Well, they did know each other for a very long time. Not that that excuses anything that they did. But the other question, of course, aside from the immediate moral issue, is the whole question of the basis on which he hired her. Now, I wouldn't always condemn an executive or a minister for hiring somebody they knew. After all, if you're presented with 6 people off the street and 1 person that you know, you may be very confident of your opinion about the person you know, and you may have a high opinion of them. The 6 people off the street, you may interview them, they may look okay, but you might say to yourself, well, I'd rather hire somebody I know and trust and I've seen them working well before, rather than somebody off the street that I don't know. So I don't really have a problem with hiring people that you know. What I have a problem with is finding jobs for your girlfriend, especially if you're married to somebody else. If it turns out that the main reason why she was hired in a publicly paid job was because she was the girlfriend of Matt Hancock, then that again is a very, very black mark against him. You know, there was a question as to why he was allowed to resign and why he wasn't fired to start with. Now, of course, Boris couldn't investigate all those questions in depth in the time he had available. I certainly think that if those issues are pursued, if he is found to have hired somebody merely because of their personal relationship, if he is found to have awarded contracts to companies where he has an interest, I'm not saying he has, I've got no firm information that he has, but there are these suggestions being raised and they do require investigation.
Of course, yeah. I mean, everything we're saying here, we're speculating. We're certainly not saying it for a fact. But I mean, to me, there's a tower building here of issues with Mr. Hancock. I mean, the first part was, yeah, there's the moral issues. Although how our prime minister can raise these issues is a little bit awkward for him. But there are moral issues, and I know some people care about those. I personally don't. But you go as further than that, because then there's, say, the issue: did he employ her because she was his girlfriend, which is against the rules? But then let's go further than that. You've just mentioned it yourself: the security breach, which is incredibly serious. This is an office of someone who was one of the most important people in the government of our country during this pandemic, particularly. But you go further than that. You look at dealings and potential issues of conflicts of interest on multi-billion-pound contracts, and so it goes up and up and up in scales of importance. And the guy gets to resign based on the I'm doing it for my family argument, and just talk about the bit of humorous fact that this rather awkward looking man's video groping an attractive woman. It should not be allowed to distract from the fact there are massively important things. There should be a full and open inquiry with potential charges being raised if evidence arises, surely.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the old principle of no smoke without fire. Well, who knows? But it certainly doesn't look good for him.
No.
I think he's going to face lots of questions. The other factor, of course, is he's also facing questions from his constituency party. And I think a motion has been brought forward within his constituency party to deselect him. I don't know whether that will go anywhere or not. Last thing we want is a by-election, I would have thought. But he certainly faces problems not only in Westminster, not only possibly in the courts, but also very much with his constituency party.
Well, I think in common with, but separately too, independently of our old colleague Godfrey Bloom, I predicted probably a year ago that Mr. Hancock might well potentially one day end up in jail. So I wish I'd put a bet on, because I think there's a possibility of that, and I wouldn't lose any sleep about it if it did happen, frankly. I think for many reasons, I'd like to see that. But that's, of course, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, and we can say no more than that.
He looks a little closer to it now than he did a year ago, anyway.
Yes, he does. And I can honestly say that fills me with glee. The other thing you've been discussing a lot this week is the situation on the Northern Ireland protocols, and issues, of course, dear to your heart, being a foremost member of the sort of Brexit movement for many years. There's been a lot of stuff coming out about this, and law precedents and legal cases about the situation. What's your take on where we are with Northern Ireland, Roger?
Well, I had a nasty shock when I read what the judge had said with this case brought by the DUP and others, arguing that the Northern Ireland Protocol actually represented a breach of the Act of Parliament under which Northern Ireland was united with Great Britain. And the judge said, yes, he said it would be a breach of that. Is it a treaty, or it is a treaty, isn't it? I guess it is a breach of that treaty. However, it is not illegal, because the act that introduced Brexit, and possibly the act that introduced the protocol as well, effectively repealed those elements in the previous Treaty of Union that would have conflicted. Now, nobody had told me that before. I didn't know that. I don't know if Boris knew it. I suspect perhaps the DUP didn't know it. And if so, they will be, first of all, surprised, as I was. And secondly, I would think they would be hugely angry. And if Boris didn't know that that was to be the effect, then, of course, he is open to criticism. I mean, I commend him for getting Brexit done one way or another, and he faced very, very difficult choices. And he may have had to swallow things he wouldn't have actually wanted to swallow, and we wouldn't have wanted him to swallow. And he got it done, and we're out, and thank God for that. But nonetheless, he's left us an awful legacy there. Now, I think what we've got to analyse is the attitude of the Irish of the Brussels Commission and the Irish government. Indeed, you may have seen an article in the Telegraph today by the ambassador of Ireland in London. And it was, this is what ambassadors are supposed to do, I suppose. It was wonderfully emollient and positive, and how we're going to work together and go the extra mile to make things work. And the sting in the tail, of course, but Britain must in the end observe the terms of the protocol. So at least he's trying to be nice about it. I was also reading the rumours through the week that Britain and Brussels were moving closer to some sort of accommodation on this problem, and that perhaps Brussels was prepared to make some concessions. So again, I was surprised and rather upset to see that their concession was a 3-month delay, but hedged about with very specific conditions. You get the 3-month delay, but you must fulfill the protocol in full at the end of the 3 months.
Yeah.
Well, that's no good. We've tried the protocol, we've tried the provisions of the protocol. They simply cannot be made to work in a way which ensures the free trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And we must ensure that free trade. It is part of the United Kingdom, it must remain part of the United Kingdom. It is not about protecting the single market. They go on ad nauseam about protecting their single market. I ask you, what harm will it do to the single market in general, or the citizens of Ireland in particular, if half a dozen English sausages leak over the border? A, it's very unlikely to happen, and B, if it does happen, in the overall scheme of things, it doesn't matter a damn. So why are they doing this? It's very clear to me. I don't know whether you saw some of the clandestine footage that was filmed of meetings within Brussels by the team they had, Barnier and his mates, who were...
Our old friend Guy Verhofstadt there as well.
Indeed. And they actually said the price to Britain of Brexit is going to be Northern Ireland. We can force a division there. And that's what they're trying to do. It is a punishment, as they see it, to Britain for Brexit. They hate the fact that we have left. They want us to feel bad about it. They want, in particular, member states, existing remaining member states, to feel bad about Brexit so that other countries don't follow suit. And that is what they're doing. And all the talk of trying to reach an accommodation, trying to make it work, is so much flim-flam. They don't want to make it work. They want to make life as difficult for us as they possibly can. And that
so
is
what do we
setting out to do?
Well, what do we do then, Roger? I mean, they're digging their heels in. What's your suggestion? Where do we go with this? I mean, how do we respond?
Well, my understanding is that Article 16 of the protocol provides that if either party concludes that some aspect of the protocol is becoming impossible to implement or is causing excessive disruption of trade, then by invoking Article 16, that party can unilaterally set aside the bits that are a problem. There are consequences of that, and the other party may respond in certain ways. But I hope very much that Lord Frost and Boris are talking about Article 16 and getting ready to invoke it. Because it is absolutely clear that it is a major trade disruptor between different parts of the United Kingdom. It cannot be allowed to go on, and therefore we have to do something to stop it. And we're not even, as it were, breaking the terms of the protocol, because the protocol does provide that where things are simply not working, they can be reconsidered, and that is what we must do.
Now, this whole thing, like with so many other issues to do with Boris Johnson, it raises a question that I really want to put to you, because you've always struck me as a good judge of character, and I've always thought so. Anyway, you've always been able to read people pretty well. I suppose that with business and politics you have to. Everything Boris Johnson does leads you to the conclusion that he is either simply not intellectually capable to understand the effects of the things he's doing, or he's blatantly lying to get his own way. I simply can't see a middle ground. And don't get me wrong, I was prepared to, be okay about that while the things he was lying about were leading to Brexit, because I thought, well, he might be a lying ratbag, but he's our lying ratbag. I thought, well, okay, I don't mind, but uh, is this too simplistic, or because to me, he can't possibly be so stupid as to not understand that everything he does leads him into another hole that he then has to dig his way out of. So is it just that he's blatantly lying to get from A to B?
I don't think he's actually consciously sitting down and saying, I cannot tell the truth here, so I will tell a lie. What he's always been very good at is just weaving forms of words that get him off the hook. For example, let's go to the Northern Ireland Protocol itself. Would there be disruption to trade? No, there will be no paperwork. Well, but there is going to be paperwork. It's actually written down there. Yes, but it's absolutely minimal. It will make no difference at all. Trade will go ahead exactly as it was. I think he half believed it. I think he half or 75% wanted to say it. So everything drove him to say it. And I do think that he's prepared to say to himself, well, okay, maybe I'm storing up some problems for the future, but we'll cross those bridges when we come to them. I think his whole style is being, perhaps glib isn't the right word, but being very articulate, talking his way out of problems. And it's worked for him. He's become leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister by dint of being articulate and sounding credible most of the time. So the other thing is, I don't think he's a detail man. Unlike Margaret Thatcher, who would sit up till 4 o'clock in the morning reading her briefs carefully, I don't think he does that at all. Possibly he's having arguments with someone at home about spilling red wine on the sofa. I don't know. But I think he goes to bed when he wants to go to bed after a couple of drinks, and sleeps well until the morning. And he relies a bit in an ad hoc way of dealing with problems as they come up. Now, he's the kind of guy who works very well, sounding positive, sounding ebullient, when things are going well, or at least going okay. It's a technique that doesn't really work so well, I think, when you're facing serious problems and you haven't really got to the bottom of those problems. He doesn't have an answer on the Northern Ireland Protocol, or if he does, he hasn't told us yet. He doesn't have an answer on the integration of social care. He had an oven-ready solution during the election. We're still waiting to hear what it is. And it's pretty clear there isn't a solution. There isn't a plan on a piece of paper. They are desperately scrabbling to put one together. So, as I say, his way of talking glibly through problems works well in good times. It works much less well in hard times. I still think in many ways his heart's in the right place, although my biggest worry is that he was a great libertarian. He was never going, for example, to allow a nanny state to dictate what we should eat and pass laws against food advertising and those things. And what's he doing now? He's passing laws against food advertising and telling us what we have to eat. He never seemed the sort of person who would get terribly exercised about issues like climate change. Far be it from me to suggest that domestic influences are at work there, but I think they are. And I think one of the concessions he's made, not to the public or to the parliament or to the opposition, but rather to his new wife, is to make louder noises about the climate change issue. And that is very, very worrying, because one of the general criticisms of this government, they will never look at cost-benefit analysis. They will never tell you, we'll have lockdown, it'll stop COVID. How much will it cost? Well, we don't know, but it's worth it. We're going to get to net zero by 2050. How much will it cost? Well, we don't know, and it's worth it. It's that sort of attitude, failing to analyse what is going wrong.
You're raising, lots of good points here. This is what I wanted to get onto, because first of all, you say he's not a details man. I wonder whether or not that's because he just can't be bothered, or whether he doesn't feel he can master the detail. But then you think about, you say he was a libertarian. Now, I think I know a libertarian when I see one. I'm pretty libertarian myself, and he did say some nice sort of semi-libertarian things. But I wonder, because one consistent thing about this man is he is very good at the long-term vision of where he personally wants to get to. And he saw Cameron's Conservative Party hugging hoodies and caring about ice caps and all the rest of the stuff. And he was looking at how can I position myself as being the alternative, but still conservative to this. And he decided to appear libertarian. And then, as we've discussed before, when it came to the referendum, Dave's going down the Remain route, I'll go down the Leave route. So again, I'm the alternative. And all of it, I think, is aimed at one thing, and that's Boris Johnson getting what Boris Johnson wants. And I don't think it's got the first thing to do with principle. Am I being cynical?
I certainly think he's driven by ambition. But was it not Boris Johnson who said as a youngster that he wanted to be king of the world? And I think later on he probably realized that that was an ambition too far.
Well, give him time.
He wanted to be prime minister, and blow me down, he's become prime minister. I do think he thinks in terms of his personal advantage, his personal career advancement. But what I would like to think now is that he recognizes that his career, well, he can hardly advance it from prime minister, but his career survival depends very much on actually getting to grips with some of these issues that he seems to be skating over at the moment.
Yeah, and of course, there's one of the things that's probably encouraging him at the moment is the fact that the Conservatives appear to be riding high in the polls. And we've got a very important by-election, Batley Spen, going on at the moment. And most of the clever money is suggesting the Conservatives are going to take that seat, which, frankly, I find astonishing, not because the Labour Party is doing very well or Keir Starmer's a prime minister in waiting, but we're in a situation where the Conservative Party has created chaos all around it, and the sleaze has reappeared, and Boris has been proven time and time again to have a problematic relationship with the truth, and yet they are absolutely smashing it. And I don't know what you think, Roger, but I would put a couple of quid on the fact they'll probably win this by-election.
Yeah, there were reports in the press this morning saying that some in the Labour Party are saying they could just edge it. Apparently, they are said to have perceived to have run a very effective campaign. And it was very neat to get the sister of Jo Cox. I mean, there's going to be a sympathy vote there. On the other hand, Galloway is clearly taking a slice of what would traditionally be a Labour vote. What was previously the Brexit vote will probably largely go to the Conservatives. I would still bet on the Conservatives winning, but I don't think it's actually a done deal yet. Question which you're asking is, how can they do so well when so much is going wrong? Well, two big things have gone right. Brexit and the vaccine rollout. I think they are getting credit for that. They're approved of for that. Certainly the Nissan decision to invest in the Northeast will not have done them any harm. So you've got those different factors working. I agree the government has made a terrible mess of PPE and of test and trace and a whole series of other things. And also, I think more and more people are upset about lockdown being continued when I think most people looking at the data would reasonably say, well, we don't really need to have any lockdown anymore. Reopen the pubs, get them working properly. Let people lean on the bar and order a drink. That would suit me very well.
Yeah, me too.
So there's a bit of resentment about that. I certainly think if I were a guy running a pub and I was just about to go bankrupt because I couldn't get enough people in, and I was told, well, okay, we've got a Euro match at the end of the week, but the rules still apply and you can't have a full pub, not even for a Euro game. I'm not sure I would be terribly keen to support the government that told me that. So I think there are some factors working against them, but I do think they've got a huge amount of tidying up to do and questions to answer.
Yeah, well, one of the reason I asked this question is because my dad, he's 80 years old. He's lived through many a Conservative government and voted for most of them in his time. And bear in mind, he lived through Ted Heath and obviously John Major and some other outstanding candidates. he stated to me the other day, which really shook me. He said, "I believe this is the most incompetent Conservative government of my lifetime."
Well, that's scary, isn't it? Because the one thing the Conservatives win on when they win, or one of the major factors that works in their favour, is they are seen as competent. Admittedly, competent in terms of managing the economy, not necessarily in terms of everything else. But if they are now seen not to be competent in a sort of broad way across large areas of policy, then that will not help them at all. I think on the plus side, they've got Rishi Sunak, who is doing quite a good job. I mean, he's in an impossible position in the sense that he knows he's spending too much money, but he has to spend too much money. So what can he do? He just has to spend it. But we will see what he does about trying to resolve the problems we face and trying to get out of the desperate debt that we're in. The only solution seems to me some combination of growth and inflation. And if you get both in the right doses, then in 5 years' time we may be square again. But it's a big call. He certainly seems to be competent, and let's hope that the health department under new management, Sajid David, he's never been in a ministerial job for very long, so it's difficult to say he's a brilliant man. On the other hand, he looks fairly solid. Let's see how he gets on. He's making the right noises to start with. So I think there is room for them to sort themselves out. They just need to start sorting.
How about having been in a televised hustings debate against Sajid David? I'll say a couple of things about him. One, that he was actually unusually pleasant backstage and genuinely friendly, which is not something I think either of us have always experienced when we've come across these people from different parties, but also incredibly difficult to ruffle. I used to pride myself that I could really lay into the other parties and at least get a flicker. Yeah, get some kind of either taking the mickey or being aggressive or something. Couldn't get a flicker from him. He was incredibly polished. So I'll say that for Mr. Javid. He's worthy of respect in that way. But one thing you said about Rishi Sunak, you think he's doing a good job under the circumstances. Sooner or later, they've got to stop inventing money. They've got to stop magicking money out of a computer. And sooner or later, something has got to give. Now, you mentioned one of the routes out of this, which is the growth and inflation thing. That's going to alienate the pensioners who would normally vote for the Conservatives massively, I would imagine. I don't know as there's a particularly coherent way out of this financial catastrophe that we've been thrown into. And I would argue of enormous overreaction to the circumstances we were in. I don't know as they've got a way out of this. I think this is the ticking time bomb. I think this is the thing that will lead to the Conservative disaster and downfall. I think they're heading for 1997 at some point.
I mean, it's certainly a plausible scenario. I don't feel that pessimistic about it. I think that they will pull it together. Not sure that, I mean, I understand what you're saying about inflation. It can be a problem for older people, although Boris seems at least to be convinced he wants to hang on to the so-called triple lock on pensions. So low-income pensioners will at least have inflation protection.
Thinking more people with savings as well.
Yeah. Well, it's a toss-up, isn't it? You've got people with savings who would like higher interest rates but don't want inflation. And you've got people with borrowings who like lower interest rates and actually don't mind a bit of inflation because it winds down their borrowings. It's a bit like exchange rates. You say, is it a good thing or a bad thing when the exchange rate goes up? Well, it helps some people and it harms other people. And there is a balance at the end of the day. Certainly, if inflation gets out of hand, then I agree with you. It's a disaster not only for pensioners, but for everybody. If we saw 15% inflation, I would be seriously worried. I think we can live with 3 to 4% inflation for a few years if it's a short-term thing.
Yeah. Well, again, that's one of those things that, and to quote again our old colleague Godfrey, he argues that the inflation figures are artificial, and that actually the figures for inflation are much higher. Which, I think I'd refer anyone to one of Godfrey's diatribes to listen to that, because actually he does make, I think, a coherent argument at least. But when we come towards the latter part here, we've spoken about the political landscape. We've spoken about various issues of the day. One thing that I think interests a lot of our viewers, and certainly I find fascinating, having been involved with insurgent politics with UKIP, there are people trying to make ground, trying to be anti-woke, fight the culture wars, pro-free speech, maybe even openly conservative in the small c sense, who are trying to make ground, Laurence Fox and people like that. Do you think that they're sort of really heading up a dead end, or do you think they might be able to make some of the kind of impact that we made with UKIP?
I think they've got a very, very tough call. Laurence Fox, great guy, agree with most of what he says, not all of it, but most of it. I think a lot of people would agree with it. But the trouble with our first past the post system, of course, is that, if Laurence Fox were standing in my local constituency, do I want a Conservative MP who will support the Conservative Party, although is, in my view, sorry about this, but a bit wet? Or do we want a Laurence Fox who is extremely sound and active and positive, but I know damn fine if I vote for him, he won't get elected? That is the issue. That is the difficulty. And our old friend Mr. Curtin, I believe, is running a Heritage Party.
Yes.
And again, I agree with almost everything he says. But I'd probably vote for him for old time's sake if I were in the constituency. But the fact is that I don't think he's got any chance of getting elected. The thing about UKIP was that, first of all, there was a charismatic leader, which is always a big factor. The other thing is there was an issue that many, many people felt very strongly about, and they felt they weren't being listened to. And indeed, I think there is another group of people who maybe weren't too committed to Brexit, but were just worried that the establishment and the Parliament and the Prime Minister and all those people, the civil service, were not listening to them, perhaps on a range of other issues, but they were not getting listened to. I think the great majority of people who voted for Brexit actually wanted Brexit. But I think there were probably some who voted for Brexit saying, one in the eye for the establishment, they're not expecting this, are they? And they weren't. And it was delightful to see their faces.
I can certainly vouch for that. On a conversation I had on a train back from London on one occasion, a couple of guys came up to me and recognised who I was and said, "Oh, great, yeah, we vote for you, we support you, we love what you do." I said, "Oh, great. So, well, hopefully we'll get us out of the EU." They said, "No, we don't want to get out of the EU. We're in favour of the EU. We just want things shaking up here. We love the way you guys go about it, and the disruption and the entertainment value is something else." And they voted for us at general elections and all sorts of things. But they were actually pro-EU, and I've often wondered to myself how many pro-EU people actually voted for us because they liked our approach.
I must tell you a story about my sister, who was older than me and sadly passed away about 18 months ago. But she was once accosted on the doorstep by a Lib Dem canvasser who asked for her vote in a local election. So she thought, well, we'll see what this guy thinks about one or two issues. So she said, well, I have to think about that. But tell me, what do you think about joining the euro? And the guy said, no, I don't want to join the euro. And she said, but don't you realize it's your Lib Dem policy to join the euro? No, is it? Yes, it is. Oh, well, I better go away and check that out. So even people are knocking on doors to promote parties, maybe don't know. The difficulty is I can't see where the huge issue is for these minor parties. Many of the issues, anti-woke, free speech, end lockdown, and so on. Yes, they're all important, and I support all of them. But to really set the average voter on fire. I mean, there was some research recently that showed that was it something like 60 or 70% of the British people don't understand what the word woke means in the context of the culture wars. So they're not going to go out and vote for an anti-woke candidate if they don't know what woke means. Whereas everybody knew what Brexit meant, and many, many people had very strong opinions about it.
Yeah, and of course the other thing is I think there's a 20 or 30% potential anti-establishment pool to fish in. And after that, you'd start hitting a glass ceiling, as we encountered ourselves. And there are too many fishermen with their rods in the pool at the moment. You mentioned David Curtin, there's Laurence Fox, there's still UKIP, there's the Brexit media organisation, whatever they call themselves, or Reform, or whatever they're called nowadays. There's all these different organisations out there, all looking for the same vote, which has got a glass ceiling of somewhere around maybe 25, 27% on it. Anyway, it makes it almost impossible, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's where we've been throughout all my life that I've ever been voting and engaged in politics. Almost always, the real choice before the voter is Labour or Conservative. And given that the real choice is Labour or Conservative, personally, I would vote Conservative. But having said that, there was a wonderful moment in British politics when there was a third choice that was both credible and incredibly popular at the time. And I'll never forget the last election I was engaged in, which must have been, 2014. I was at the results, and we watched the results in the East Midlands. And as you know, it was a proportional representation arrangement. And it was very clear from the early results that UKIP was going to walk away with it. And the big excitement of the evening was who would come second. And Labour and Conservatives were neck and neck across the East Midlands right the way through. And because of the way proportional representation works, they only had to be one vote ahead of the other in order to get two candidates and not one candidate elected. So for them, it was critically important. For me, as the top candidate on the UKIP list, we were going to get three anyway, so what the hell?
Well, I remember that night vividly because I was the third candidate in the West Midlands, and I had to wait literally until the last one came in to know whether I was elected or not, about 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was Stone in Staffordshire. I'll always be grateful to the people of Stone.
They would be Brexiteers, yeah.
Oh, they certainly were, and they got me over the line because I remember good old Tom Watson and his friends in the Labour Party jeering and shouting, thinking that they got the third place, and they were obviously we exchanged pleasantries, but that's another story. We're going to the end, Roger. A little thing coming across the bottom of the screen, you probably can't tell, but I know you're an enormous football fan. I know it's a huge thing to you, but I think even you might have been disturbed from the opera for long enough to notice that England are doing relatively well in the football and beat our good friends, the Germans. We have Ukraine on Saturday. Will you be tuning in? Will you be making a point of watching the football, or are you going to abstain and watch from a distance?
No, I tell you, whenever England plays somebody else, I don't care whether it's darts or cricket or football or rugby or whatever it is, of course I'm always pleased to hear that England is won. But I hate to admit this to you, Bill, frankly, actually watching football for me is like watching paint dry. So I won't be watching. I didn't watch the last match. I was delighted that England beat Germany. There's something in that England versus Germany. I'm sorry, it's not the Second World War, or perhaps it is the Second World War, but it's also the history between the two teams and the fact that we haven't beaten them for 55 years or something. So it was wonderful to see England beat Germany in that match. And I hope very much that England beats Ukraine on Saturday. And I send them my best wishes, but I won't be watching.
No, well, I think if there's any consolation, up until the last 20 minutes of the Germany game, it was like watching paint dry for all of us watching England play. But it's got a bit better. And you'll certainly know if we proceed in the tournament because you probably hear the screams and shouts from the rest of the country through your window. So right. You don't need to watch the game for that. Roger, as always, it's been a great pleasure. I appreciate the amount of time you've given us tonight. And I want to thank you so much for being on board and joining us and giving us your views as ever in your typical articulate way. And it's been always a pleasure to see you again. And we shall have to say goodnight now. So to everyone, if you've enjoyed our conversation, Roger's very active on social media. Check out his Twitter account. You will find lots and lots to discuss with him. And he does like a good debate. I think that's fair to say. So check out Roger on Twitter. But please, if you've enjoyed this, like us on YouTube, share us around, tell people about it. and let's get more views so we can get more interesting conversation and debate like we've had tonight. But for now, I wish you all a very good evening.
Good evening.